A former cop pulls a gun in court, thinking he can intimidate his way out of justice. But Judge Monroe Avery doesn't flinch, and what follows is bigger than one man. As the trial unravels, buried secrets surface, exposing a system built to protect the powerful. This isn't just about guilt or innocence. It's about who the law really serves when silence breaks. If stories like this pull you in, don't forget to subscribe. What happens next might surprise you. The marble pillars of the Dalton Federal Courthouse stood stoic under a sky thick with low-hanging clouds, the kind that made the whole city feel like it was holding its breath. Inside courtroom 4B was electric, buzzing not with noise but with tension. Seats were filled before the doors opened. Staffers with no business being there drifted in and stayed. Reporters occupied the entire press gallery, their devices silenced but poised. Even the security detail, seasoned U.S. Marshals, stood a bit stiffer than usual, glancing often toward the defense table. Seated at that table was former officer Caleb Stokes, once a decorated member of the Dalton Police Department. Today he wore a suit that didn't quite fit, too tight across the shoulders, sleeves too short. He leaned back like he was in a squad car, arms folded, legs wide. He didn't glance around. He didn't need to. He wanted them to look. Across the courtroom, the East Corridor door opened quietly, and Judge Monroe Avery stepped through. Tall, composed, a black woman who had spent over 20 years behind the bench without flinching. Her robe was draped neatly over her arm as she walked, her heels striking marble with quiet certainty. She passed two clerks whispering by the stairwell. They fell silent when they saw her. She didn't acknowledge them, not out of rudeness, but necessity. She'd long learned that being underestimated was one of her sharpest tools. Inside, Caleb's lawyer, Daniel Morrow, pale, graying, and visibly exhausted, leaned toward his client. "Keep your mouth shut today," he murmured, low enough that only the man beside him could hear. No commentary, no smirks. "Let me work." Caleb's lip curled. "You act like I'm the one on trial." "You are," Daniel snapped. "And one more outburst means jail time before the verdict's even read." Caleb exhaled a laugh through his nose. "If she were a real judge, we wouldn't even be here." Daniel sat back, his silence admitting defeat. In the gallery, even those who didn't know the full details of the case felt the undercurrent. Something heavy, something unresolved. What they knew was this: Caleb Stokes had been charged with falsifying reports, excessive use of force, and tampering with department-issued footage. What they didn't know, what was only whispered in closed rooms, was how much of the department had helped him do it. The trial was supposed to focus on one incident, but everyone suspected the courtroom walls were holding back an avalanche. The bailiff's voice broke through the room. "All rise!" Judge Avery donned her robe as she stepped onto the bench, her presence quiet but firm. She sat, nodded once, and the courtroom followed suit. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and clear. "We will resume with the witness testimony." The prosecution called their next expert, a forensic audio-visual analyst. The woman walked confidently to the stand, took her oath, and adjusted the microphone. Her testimony wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. She described inconsistencies between the body cam logs and department reports, missing timestamps, edited footage, and a strange pattern of equipment failures that just happened to occur during high-profile incidents. Caleb shifted in his seat. "Lies," he muttered, not quite under his breath. Judge Avery's eyes drifted toward him, cool and unbothered. "Mr. Stokes," she said, "you will remain silent during testimony." He leaned forward slightly, voice low. "With all due respect, Your Honor, am I supposed to sit here while she fabricates?" "You're here to listen," she said. "Your counsel will have the opportunity to cross-examine shortly." Caleb sneered. "Sure, like that'll matter." One of the marshals near the gallery subtly adjusted his stance, hand not quite touching his holster, but close. The judge noticed. She raised her hand, not to quiet Caleb, but to steady the room. She didn't need backup. Not yet. The analyst continued. Her voice was steady, her facts difficult to argue with. When she concluded, she stepped down. The air shifted slightly, heavier now, more focused. "We'll take a 10-minute recess," Judge Avery said, tapping the gavel once. As the gallery filed out in murmurs, she remained at the bench, her gaze flickering briefly to Caleb. He was smiling, but not pleasantly, more like a man who thought he knew something no one else did. She stood composed and walked to her chambers, her pace slow, deliberate. Not because she feared him, but because she had seen that smile before, in men who mistook silence for control. And she knew, without question, that Caleb Stokes had not yet shown his full hand. But neither had she. The courtroom refilled slowly after recess, but something had changed in the air, something subtle and tense, like the way the sky feels before a summer storm. The reporters no longer leaned back in their seats. The marshals were now posted at more corners than before, communicating silently. And Caleb Stokes was already back in his chair, still as stone, hands resting calmly on the table. But those hands twitched. Not obviously, not enough to raise alarm. Just a subtle tap of a finger, a slight shift in muscle. If you weren't watching for it, you'd miss it. Judge Avery didn't miss it. When she re-entered, she did so with the same grace as always. Her robe brushed quietly behind her as she moved. She looked out over the courtroom like someone taking the temperature of the room, feeling not just the tension, but the readiness of it. "You may proceed with the cross-examination," she said, her gaze briefly resting on the defense table. Daniel Morrow stood. His questions to the forensic analyst were sharp, strategic. He tried to cast doubt on the timelines, the interpretations, the validity of the so-called missing footage. But the analyst held her ground. Her answers didn't waver, and with each failed challenge, the defense's narrative lost shape. Caleb didn't like it. He shifted in his seat, then again, murmuring something no one could quite hear. But the bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. When the analyst brought up body cam edits again, Caleb scoffed, a single hard exhale of disbelief that drew eyes. "Mr. Stokes," Judge Avery said, her voice low but firm, "you've been warned." "I'm not interrupting," he said, loud enough now for the back row to hear. "I'm reacting. There's a difference." "One more remark and you will be removed," she said, not raising her voice, but narrowing her tone like a scalpel. He leaned back again, arms folded, and smiled. The analyst stepped down. The next witness was unexpected. Sergeant Alvaro Reyes, a former colleague who had once filed an internal complaint against Stokes. The room stilled. Even Caleb sat straighter. Reyes testified without embellishment. He described an incident in 2019 where Stokes had used excessive force during a traffic stop. The body cam footage submitted was incomplete. Reyes had raised the alarm, but nothing had happened. The reviewing officer resigned 2 years later. "This is garbage," Caleb muttered. Judge Avery gave him a look, sharp and specific. "Mr. Stokes." "No, come on," he said louder. "That man hated me. Everyone knew it. Now he's supposed to be some moral compass?" "You are out of order," she said, more forcefully now. Reyes hesitated on the stand. The prosecutor signaled a pause, and that was when Caleb stood. A chair scraped loudly against polished wood. The sound snapped through the room like a gunshot. The gallery gasped. "You think this isn't biased?" he said, pointing, not with his hand, but with his words, at the judge. "This whole thing was doomed the second I saw who was wearing that robe." Judge Avery didn't move. "Mr. Stokes, sit down." "You want to talk about bias?" he said, voice rising. "Let's talk about yours. Every decision you've made, every ruling aimed at bringing me down." One of the marshals took a step forward, hand resting lightly on his belt, but Judge Avery raised her hand. "Not yet." And then it happened. Caleb's right hand dipped slowly toward his waistband, beneath his jacket. The moment stretched thin. Judge Avery's eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She had seen this movement before, in courtrooms and police reports, in the subtle rhythms of power unspooling into desperation. Her hand hovered just above the panic button under the bench, but didn't press it. Not yet. "Mr. Stokes," she said, voice cool, "do not move." But he already had. He pulled something small, matte black, from beneath his jacket. Not fast, not erratic. Precise, rehearsed. The kind of movement that came from hours in uniform, from the confidence of someone who knew exactly how long it would take before others reacted. Gasps broke into full screams now. A reporter dropped her pen. An intern ducked behind the gallery rail. Caleb lifted the gun into the open air, leveled it, not at anyone directly, just out, forward, toward the judge's bench. The marshals moved, but not with panic. They had trained for this. Two doors burst open at once. SWAT, shields, rifles, commands echoing through the chamber like rolling thunder. "Drop the weapon! On the ground!" In that second, Caleb turned to Judge Avery one last time, gun still raised but not yet fired. "You think you've won," he said, breath heaving, voice cracking. "You haven't," she replied, "but you just proved everyone right." He didn't fire. He couldn't. The moment he flinched, a SWAT officer struck him from the right, shield first. Another grabbed the gun hand, twisting it skyward as others swarmed. The weapon clattered to the floor, never discharged. And just like that, it was over. No gunfire, no blood, just the sound of metal against marble in a courtroom full of people who would never see silence the same way again. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a tide retreating from the wreckage it hadn't quite caused. People didn't rush. They moved cautiously, like survivors stepping out of a building that still might collapse. Caleb Stokes lay face down on the polished wood, his hands now cuffed tightly behind him, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. One officer kicked the discarded weapon across the floor until it clattered to a stop beneath the prosecution table. Judge Monroe Avery remained still for several seconds behind the bench. Her robe shifted slightly with the rise and fall of her breath, but her expression didn't change. She hadn't flinched when the gun was raised. She didn't flinch now. When she finally stood, she didn't address the room. She stepped down slowly, her heels measured, her presence still commanding. She passed Caleb without a glance. He didn't look at her either. Whatever was left of his defiance had drained away the moment his weapon was wrestled from him. Back in her chambers, she removed her robe and hung it with care. Then she sat at her desk and did what she hadn't done in years. Pulled out the internal records she had started gathering months ago, before the trial even began. The folder was thin, too thin for the years of complaints that had trailed Caleb Stokes like smoke. Suspicious use of force reports, incomplete footage logs, mysteriously closed investigations. None of it had ever reached a public hearing, until now. She didn't have proof of conspiracy, not yet, but what she did have were patterns and names. Supervisors who signed off on every clearance, internal affairs officers who marked reports unfounded without interviews. And in the background of almost every complaint, one name appeared again and again: Captain James Harwood, the head of the Internal Review Division during most of Stokes' tenure. She circled the name, then reached for her phone. "Get me Inspector Carla Nguyen," she said to her clerk. "Tell her I want to meet today, quietly." Nguyen arrived just before dusk. A former homicide detective turned internal investigator, she had the sharp, unsmiling air of someone who preferred facts over headlines. She carried a slim laptop and a folder of her own. "I assume you saw the footage," Judge Avery began. "Already reviewed the security feed twice," Nguyen said. "Clean breach. Good timing. No casualties. But that's not the story, is it?" Avery nodded once. "The story is how a man like Caleb Stokes carried a gun into a federal courtroom under the radar, and how nobody stopped him until it was nearly too late." Nguyen opened her laptop. "You're thinking inside job?" "I'm thinking inside culture," Avery replied. "He didn't hide the gun in his sock. He walked in without being scanned. Someone waved him through." Nguyen typed quickly. "I can start pulling entry logs, badge scans. But if this goes deep, if the pattern of protection is systemic, it won't be enough to pull on the thread. We'll need a map." Avery reached into her drawer and pulled out a folded sheet, a crude but meticulous timeline of every complaint Stokes had received, cross-referenced with department reviews. Nguyen scanned it, nodding. "Some of these are ones I tried to get reopened years ago. Hit a wall." "That wall had names," Avery said. "We're going to knock them down, one by one." Nguyen looked up. "You're not going to get support from the department." "I'm not asking," Avery said flatly, "but I want this airtight. Quiet for now. Every report, every clearance, every officer who signed off. If we move too fast, they'll start shredding documents." Nguyen smirked faintly. "I already have 2 officers embedded in records. Quiet ones. We'll keep it internal until it's too big to bury." "And then," Avery said, "we go public." By morning, the headlines were already burning through local networks. "Former officer draws weapon in federal courtroom. Judge Avery unshaken amid crisis." Gunman apprehended before shots fired. What the headlines missed, but what Avery knew, was that this wasn't an isolated outburst. It was the tip of a submerged wreck, and the waters were finally receding. The mayor's office issued a brief statement. The police department announced an internal review. But Avery wasn't waiting for promises. By the end of the week, she had partnered with Tiffany Hall, a local journalist with a record for digging up what others preferred to keep buried. Tiffany had been watching the Stokes case from the beginning, but now she was asking new questions. How does someone with a dozen complaints stay in uniform for over a decade? She asked over coffee. You're about to find out, Avery said, sliding her the redacted files. And the system that kept him clean? We're going to name it. Tiffany raised an eyebrow. You're not just going after a cop, you're going after a machine. No, Avery said. I'm going after the silence that let the machine run. The hearing room inside the state capitol wasn't built for confrontation. Its wood-paneled walls, sun-bleached flags, and slightly crooked state seal gave it the air of procedural boredom, the kind of place where decisions are whispered, not shouted. But on this day, the room throbbed with expectation. Every seat was filled, lines wrapped around the corridors. The press swarmed the hallway like bees, their cameras humming, their microphones pointed toward the double doors. And for the first time, Judge Monroe Avery wasn't presiding. She was sitting in the front row, just another citizen, just another voice ready to speak. She hadn't asked to testify during the first session. She didn't need to. The people she'd helped uncover were already speaking loudly enough. The first witness was Lena Holbrook, a mother who had filed a complaint against Caleb Stokes 5 years ago. Her teenage son had been thrown to the ground during a routine stop. No charges had ever been filed, but her complaint had been dismissed within a week. Insufficient evidence, they said, though the bruises told another story. She held up hospital photos, her hands steady. They told me the body cam wasn't working that day, but my son heard it beep when the officer turned it on. The panel said nothing, but they were listening now. The second witness was Officer Richard Tully, recently retired. Small in stature, but his voice carried. He spoke of quiet corrections, of how younger officers were advised not to file formal reports. If you saw something wrong, you were told to write it soft, or not at all, he said. And if you didn't listen, you got moved, or frozen out. The gallery leaned forward. By the fourth witness, a former administrative assistant from Internal Affairs, the room had fallen silent in a way no courtroom ever could. She brought emails, sign-off forms, a printed transcript from a meeting where a department head suggested burying a misconduct report by rerouting it into a non-disciplinary file. No one interrupted her. No one dared. That evening, Tiffany Hall published a new article, How a City Buried Its Truth, a System Built to Forget. It wasn't sensational, it was surgical. Names, dates, incident numbers, all tied to reports that had vanished, officers reassigned, cases sealed behind opaque language like resolved internally. The fallout was immediate. The State Oversight Committee announced that its next session would be held publicly and broadcast statewide. Internal Affairs issued a statement promising full cooperation. But Avery knew better than to wait on promises. She was already 2 steps ahead. In her office, she and Carlin Guyen worked late into the night. The walls were no longer just walls. They were maps now. Photos, red string, reports, a quiet web of complicity. We found clearance memos for 3 of the most serious cases, Carla said, pinning up another document, all signed by Captain Harwood. Avery nodded. And the DA's office? They received at least 2 early warnings, didn't act on either. Names? Assistant DA Glenn Tabor and Chief Investigator Lorna Keene, both still in office. Avery turned to her desk. She picked up a pen and began drafting a letter, not to the police department, not to the mayor, but to the State Commission on Judicial and Law Enforcement Conduct. The letter was short, unemotional, but it contained 5 names and a request for administrative review. The next day, the headlines changed tone. Formal inquiry opens into police oversight failures. State committee subpoenas high-ranking officials in Stokes' case. At the Capitol, District Attorney Leonard Price finally made his move. He requested a private meeting with Judge Avery. He opened with a smile. Let's be reasonable, Monroe. We've got enough on our plates without turning this into a witch hunt. "This isn't a hunt," she replied. "It's a reckoning." "Look," he said, leaning forward. "You've made your point. He's behind bars. We can handle this from here." "You had the files last year, Leonard," she said, her voice calm. "And the year before. And you did nothing." He exhaled slowly, like a man trying to appear thoughtful while stalling. "You're going to make enemies pushing this far." "I already have," she replied, "but I'm not afraid of enemies. I'm afraid of silence." By week's end, the committee issued its first resolution, a full freeze on new hiring within the Dalton Police Department, pending review of its training and internal oversight processes. Captain Harwood was placed on unpaid leave. A second hearing was scheduled, and this time Judge Avery would testify. She sat behind the microphone, hands folded. "I have submitted documentation connecting 8 officers to falsified reports," she said. 5 supervisors to cleared complaints that were never independently reviewed. 2 assistant district attorneys who dismissed misconduct cases without notifying victims. Her voice did not rise, it didn't need to. They all connect back to one officer, but none of them stop with him. The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The silence was louder than anything now. And for the first time, it wasn't working in the system's favor. The courthouse looked the same from the outside. Same stone pillars, same steps worn smooth by decades of cautious feet. But inside, the air was different. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't even anger. It was awareness. That quiet gravity that settles over a place when people realize it can't go back to what it was. Caleb Stokes sat at the defense table, dressed in a plain gray suit. He looked thinner now. The swagger that once curled in his shoulders had fallen away, replaced by a hollow stillness. No uniform, no badge, no supporters seated behind him. Only his attorney, still loyal in posture, but not in spirit. The trial had been short, the evidence overwhelming. The jury wasn't asked to unravel the case of a misunderstood officer. They were asked to weigh intent. Caleb had brought a weapon into a federal courtroom. He had raised it at a sitting judge. The fact that he hadn't pulled the trigger didn't erase what he had done. It clarified it. Judge Monroe Avery didn't preside over this trial. She sat in the gallery this time, dressed simply, her robe left behind in chambers. Around her were community members, journalists, and those whose lives had once passed silently through the justice system. Now they were witnesses not just to a verdict, but to a shift. The prosecutor stood, gave closing arguments that were calm, factual, and final. "He didn't just threaten a judge," she said. "He threatened a truth, that no one is above the law, not even those once protected by it." The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours. When they returned, no one moved. No one breathed too loudly. The 4 persons stood, hands trembling only slightly. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. Attempted murder of a federal judge, brandishing a weapon in a secured government facility, obstruction, threats of violence, resisting arrest, no parole eligibility." There was no gasp, no outcry. Only a slow exhale, like the building itself had been holding its breath. Caleb didn't react. He didn't protest. He didn't plead. He looked down and stayed that way. Judge Avery didn't smile. She didn't close her eyes or bow her head. She just watched, steady and unflinching, the same way she had the day he first stood and reached for his coat. But outside the courtroom, things were already moving. Tiffany Hall's latest article had gone live that morning, not with Caleb's name, but with another, the judge who didn't flinch, how Monroe Avery helped a city face itself. It wasn't a tribute, it was a blueprint. It traced the steps taken from silence to testimony, from buried complaints to public hearings, from passive oversight to systemic change. And change was already taking form. A new civilian oversight board had been formally approved. Its charter was clear, unfiltered, and enforceable. Transparency mandates, whistleblower protections, independent review authority. No more buried files, no more resolved internally. The board would answer not to the department, but to the public. The police union released a carefully worded statement: respect for the process, support for fair reform. But behind the doors of City Hall, the conversation was different. 3 more officers had resigned quietly. The Internal Affairs Division was being dissolved and rebuilt from the ground up. And Judge Avery? She was being invited to speak, not just in Dalton, but in cities across the country. Panels, task forces, national reform efforts. But she didn't seek cameras. She didn't accept interviews. She went to her office each morning as she always had. Quiet, steady, a robe on a hanger, a case file on her desk. One afternoon, she passed a mural newly painted on the North Courthouse wall. It had started in chalk, just one name, drawn by a teenager who had stood outside the courtroom every Saturday with her mother. Then more names appeared, some of those hurt, some of those who had stood, officers who testified, clerks who came forward, dispatchers who refused to look the other way. Avery didn't stop, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer belonged to her. The mural belonged to the city now. At a nearby intersection, she passed a group of students handing out flyers. One girl, no older than 16, recognized her. "You're the judge, right?" the girl said. Avery nodded. "Thanks for not backing down," the girl continued. "We're doing a whole civics project on you." Avery offered the smallest smile. "Make sure they teach you the full story," she said, "not just the verdict." "They are," the girl replied. "Our teacher says justice isn't about who wins. It's about who keeps standing when it gets hard." Avery nodded. "Then you've got the right teacher." And she kept walking, not because her work was done, but because it wasn't. Not yet. And this time she wasn't walking alone.